All right, thank you so much, everyone who is trickling in to be a virtual audience for Queering Preservation, Multidisciplinary Approaches to Telling LGBTQ Stories. Uh, so grateful for you to take the time out of your busy lives to share this virtual space with us. Thank you for being here. This is the second year for Dismantle Preservation Unconference, and this is a free event thanks to the support of the Alpha Wood Foundation, Eileen and Norman Tyler, and Museum Hack. And while this event is free, attendees are being encouraged to donate to maybe one of the nonprofits or charities that's referenced in the chats that our presentations reference. Or we've also selected 5 nonprofits as well that I believe are helping shape the future of preservation. One of them in particular I'd like to note is somewhat loosely connected to our conversation today with Queering Preservation. The organization is called House of Tulip. They're based in New Orleans, Louisiana, and they specifically purchase older and vacant properties, restore them to create safe living situations for trans and non-binary individuals. It's a wonderful organization that I hope all of you will choose to support either through a financial gift or by following them on social media. So thank you so much for being here with us today. And Ty has gone and shared a resource guide in the chat, which is going to be your homework. I'll pass the torch to our Queering Preservation panel.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hello, everybody. My name is Ty Ginter, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am the founder of DC Diaries, which is an oral history memory mapping project of lesbian and sapphic spaces in Washington, DC, and I'm going to be the moderator for tonight. And I am so excited to introduce all of these wonderful panelists who have so graciously taken the time to speak with you, to speak today and have this really awesome conversation about the work that we do, how it can be improved, how we sort of exist in the space and all that. So I'm just going to go down the list that I have. So Alexis, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Alexis Rodriguez. My pronouns are he, his, him. I'm a graduate student at the University of Central Florida, and I'm also the vice president of the LGBTQ History Museum of Central Florida. I'm focused on oral histories and female impersonation subcultures.
Awesome, thank you. Beck, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Beck. I use they, them pronouns. I am a rising third-year PhD student at the University of Michigan, and I study organic chemistry, so I'm working towards my PhD in chemistry. Also run a podcast called My Fave Queer Chemist, in which I just interview LGBTQ+ chemistry graduate students, professionals, academics, etc. And so through that, I've done a lot of queer history preservation in the chemistry field specifically. And I'm just happy to be here and happy to be included.
Awesome, thank you so much. Emma, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Emma Johansson. I use they, them, or she, her pronouns. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Louisville. I'm the founder of the Kentucky Queer History Project, and I'm collections assistant at the Filson Historical Society. I love studying queer Southern histories and ways in which the archives are a space of political activism and heritage creation.
Thank you. Marcus?
Yeah, hi everybody. Real excited to be here to speak with you all and to converse with the other panelists. My name is Marcus Brooks. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cincinnati studying sociology. My work generally kind of deals with digital culture and race, but also with this focus on race and Black sociology. I've done some historical work of kind of pulling out of the archives and pulling out the history narrative about Augustus Granville Dill, who is a Black queer sociologist who worked with W.E.B. Du Bois and did all kinds of different things. And I kind of use his work and his history to offer a lens for us within the field of sociology to reconsider our own histories how we reconsider what is considered legitimate sociological labor and work. And I'm sure I'll discuss some of it more as we continue on, but I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Sarah, last but not least.
Thanks, Ty. My name is Sarah. I am originally from a small town in Mississippi, but I'm currently in Carrollton, Georgia at the University of West Georgia, working on my master's in public history, which for those who don't know, public history is just a catch-all term for any type of history that engages those perhaps who don't study history all the time like we do. And so I have, coming from that public history background and working on that in my education, I have a variety of experience working in museum education, tourism, digital archiving, preservation work, and other parts of the public history field. A lot of my work right now is focused on, my main interest is oral history research and kind of the ways that we can rebuild and remake and fill in gaps in the archive through oral histories, specifically queer oral histories. And so I work not only in kind of capturing those and making those accessible, but then also helping preserve those and finding all the different ways to do that. And I've worked on a variety of projects playing into that. Currently, I work as the graduate research, just to add a title, I guess I work at the as a graduate research assistant at the Center for Public History at West Georgia. So I'm also working on several different projects with them. A lot of my history work, I think, is focused on history as an empathy building tool. And then also working through my public history work to provide spaces and the tools to have really difficult conversations, which is what I think history has the ability to do. So I'm super excited to be here. I'm right now in the middle of traveling, so y'all are able to catch me in a hotel, which my place does not look this nice. But I'm super excited to be here, and I'm really excited to hear from my brilliant colleagues about their kind of ideas of the stuff we talk about. And thank everyone for tuning in.
Well, thank you, everyone, for introducing yourselves, and we're just going to jump right into it. So, all of us work or touch heritage in some way, and a lot of the work that we do has to do with memory or lack of memory, be it artifacts, oral histories, putting things like in or outside of the of existence. Some of our things don't exist anymore. Some of them only exist in the archives. So I'd really like to start our conversation sort of by talking about some of the challenges we've faced with oral history and oral history memory, and some of the challenges that we found in our work, and what we've learned from them, and what we've been able to discern from our work. So I open the floor.
I think that in my line of work, kind of speaking to some of the prompts you brought up, Ty, about kind of hurdles and the fact that a lot of this historical knowledge, broadly defined, is often invisible, both for reasons of intentional erasure from archives, an unwillingness to talk about LGBTQ experiences due to perhaps a variety of isms, but I think also a great lack of education until very recently on sexuality and gender as it actually is, as opposed to what many sects of society hope it would be. But then there's also this element of which not everyone from this community wants to go spread their story around, both for issues of safety and then also for issues of privacy. As much as, I think one of the interesting aspects of doing queer history is that on one hand, it is one of the reasons that I think a lot of folks and kind of institutions that are in this kind of traditional mindset, one of the reasons they're unwilling to start telling these stories and exploring these stories, even within their own institution, is that it is seen as salacious because there is still this very difficult and complicated connection in, and, you know, we're a bunch of young folks here, you know, talking, but in many older generations' minds of equating queerness with sex. So all of a sudden there's an assumption queerness is being talked about, sex is being talked about, and that's inappropriate. So that's getting into the issues of talking about sex is a completely different conversation. But so there are aspects to which, you know, that can be a hindrance. But at the same time, you know, this is sexual exploration for people that is connected to identity. And so that is a really vulnerable topic for a lot of folks, especially folks who are not public and out and doing panels called queering, you know, preservation. And so those are a few of the different aspects of the work that I've needed to keep in mind and that I've learned from doing particularly oral history work, which is an interesting aspect of it. And I'm curious to hear from the other panelists of other aspects as well, because I found through oral history work, that is a very personal way of telling one story and a very powerful way of telling such a personal and inherently intimate part of one's life, because you're using your own words as opposed to using a prescription of appropriate words. So those are just a few of the things that I think I've learned, and so maybe it might be a good jumping off point for some of my other panelists.
Yeah, I think with the work that I've been doing with my collections research at the Filson, and also the research I've been doing for the Kentucky Queer History Project, you know, these are very deeply personal histories that, you know, I've had to omit names of people that are still alive. Some of my artifacts and the sources that I've looked at, names and faces have been redacted from photographs, from manuscripts, from VHS tapes. And I think that a lot of that harkens back to not just a sense of privacy, but also I think there's kind of a collective notion in the public that, you know, individual stories don't matter. I'm working with a collection right now that's just your kind of run-of-the-mill couple. You know, they lived their lives together. They've been partners for 40, 50 years. And, you know, going through their artifacts and their manuscripts, there are birthday cards and, you know, desk plates and uniforms that, you know, in any other collection, it wouldn't necessarily be, it wouldn't necessarily scream like, oh, this is something worth preserving, but it is, you know, and with living documents, there's a lot of ethics. With living donors, there's a lot of ethics behind, you know, how do we treat collections with people that are still alive? You know, do we omit names of previous partners, of children that they've had with like previous relationships? You know, how do we handle that when, you know, a lot of these very intimate stories are being given and preserved in an archive? But something that's very special about this collection is that because the donors are still alive, we're able to have them write their own stories and create like the metadata and the cataloging descriptions that usually would be done by somebody that's outside of the collection, that's looking in from outside of the bubble. And something really magical about that is because the smallest artifacts are like, there was a matchbox from a cafe in like DC or wherever they went on vacation, and you know, one of the donors had an amazing story behind it that I never would have guessed by looking at a tiny matchbox from a restaurant from 40 years ago. And there's a lot of queer history that's like that you have to have a very keen eye to search for. But I think that's what makes our work especially necessary, is because that personal is political. Even if people are, you know, shy to tell these stories, or they are kind of hesitant to reveal so much intimate stuff about themselves, you know, it's evident of a larger kind of political movement. You know, we're all part of like a larger gear, a larger kind of mechanism and an arc towards justice that is really important to preserve, especially for marginalized communities. So yeah, I definitely agree with Sarah's point of history being about empathy building. That's a lot between like the work that I do. It's, you know, education telling people within our community that, you know, they're like, your identities and what you're going through is not new. You are part of a line of people that are like you and have been like you. And
Did we lose Emma? I think we lost Emma. Oh no. Well, sort of jumping off from that point, I know we have two, Alexis and Marcus, both of you work sort of with non-oral histories. You work more in the archives. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced, sort of having to like dig through all the stuff to find the queerness, to find the gayness? Can you talk a little bit about that and some of those things that you've done?
Yeah, sure. So actually, I do focus more on oral histories. I do both.
My apologies.
Going off of what Emma was mentioning about the intimacy in the archives or the oral histories, what I've noticed the times that I've done oral histories, they've been very open about it, about certain things, especially infidelity. There was one oral history where the interviewee started breaking down crying because his partner passed away from AIDS. And I wanted to stop the camera, but he insisted no, to keep it recording, because this needs to be recorded. So that's something that I guess I've experienced in terms of oral history. But I think one of the things I've noticed the most has been the conflicting histories in itself. A lot of subjectivity, issues of subjectivity. For example, there's still controversy as to when the first Pride picnic happened in Central Florida. Even though people have been there, they're still alive. They're still arguing to this day, when was the first Pride picnic? So now transferring to the whole archives, the archives are a bit of an issue, but I'll touch that point later. Marcus, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I'm just kind of keeping track of everything. So one thing that I wanted to kind of touch on that Sarah brought up early on that was really kind of stood out to me was the idea of queerness as sex, and kind of like how institutionally that might be part of that process of forgetting that these are the things that we don't want to know or we don't want to acknowledge. And one of the things that I've thought, because one of the goals of my project is to kind of put this person who I researched, Augustus Granville, back into the memory and the institution and the discipline of sociology. And so when I was going through and thinking about what do we know about him, incidentally, of my hypotheses of why was he forgotten, one of the reasons that I kind of pretty quickly kind of did away with was that he was queer. Because as I looked through at like the kind of like encyclopedic entries or the one or two paragraphs or sentences in a book or this person's biography, kind of all we knew about him was that he was queer. That is the thing that he was known for. He was W.E.B. Du Bois's gay friend, gay colleague. That's basically all it was. So part of the process then for me of doing this work was acknowledging that queerness, but also situating that outside of his work in a little bit. And of course, it's not going to be 100% separate, but part of my process then was looking at what were the things that he actually contributed to this field, to his community, because so much of what he did, so he was born in 1881, died in 1956, and he was living in Harlem during the Renaissance era. And so much of his work after he left the academy, he worked at Atlanta University for a while and was the head of sociology there. So much of his work was in Harlem, in New York. And even when he had opportunities to go elsewhere, to go back down south and teach, he was very much in that Black queer community in Harlem, but also doing work that kind of stemmed from his sociological training, rooted in Black sociology, which has this ideal that any sociological work done with or for Black people also must be for the benefit of those people. And drawing from Du Bois and his idea of the Talented Tenth, Dill was really living those ideals that coming from his work and his research and his position as a scholar and a sociologist and a PhD holder, that he had a responsibility back to his community, but also his community was not just Black people just in general, but also the queerness and the Black queerness happening in Harlem at the time. And a note also, because I know everyone was kind of talking about oral histories. So for this project, kind of getting to your question, Ty and Alexis, a little bit about the archives. So my issue with the archives happened much because, as I mentioned, much of what I was able to find just off of first glance were little sentences and encyclopedia entries, or in the book Queer History of New York, or Gay New York, I believe it's called. There's a little section in there about him. And again, it goes back to the notion of all that we know about him is that he was queer or gay. I choose to say queer. But that also got me to this question of whose histories do we preserve and whose histories do we take those steps of making accessible. So one of the things that I was, one archive resource that I was able to use was the Du Bois papers housed on University of Massachusetts server, and they have an archive of all these documents related to W.E.B. Du Bois. So included in that were letters and correspondence with Augustus Granville Dill from Du Bois, but those were situated in the context of his relationship to this person that we know more of. And as I mentioned earlier, Dill did work and attended Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia, now Clark Atlanta. And I did find that there were archives of his papers, of his writings for his years that were there. But the interesting about that is those, even though the Clark Atlanta Library, the Woodruff Library, did have some digital archives, none of his papers were digitized. So I actually had to travel down there and physically go through these pages and pages of written documents from him. And one of the kind of institutional barriers that I came up there that I actually kind of skirted a little bit was that in this archive, and maybe some of the other panelists can speak to this, because again, I'm not a historian, I'm a sociologist. So this was my only experience with the physical archive. One of the limitations when I went to the archive was that I was only able to photocopy or take pictures or digitize something like 20% or 15% of the entire catalog. Now, I'll out myself and say I took photos of every document I could get across, and I'll probably putting myself out, I'm probably get in trouble for that. But I mean, that was really my only way. I was in Atlanta for a day and had to leave. So, so again, there's this issue that these documents exist, but this person, for many reasons related to his queerness and his work, and his queerness causing the schism between him and W.E.B. Du Bois, who is this larger figure, then causes these records to just kind of sit there and languish until you go looking for them. And then you have to have the support, the resources, the finances to travel there and access to those records if you're not there. So yeah, there are lots of different issues and difficulties with doing this work.
Give me 1 second, Alexis. Beck, do you have anything to add since you've been a little bit quiet?
Well, I don't want to cut off the conversation. Alexis, if you have anything that you want to piggyback off of, Marcus.
Yeah, sure. So building off of Marcus, one of the issues with our archives, for example, is grassroots. So we have at the moment, we're transferring all the materials to the archives of UCF, because before it wasn't a storage unit, which we called the archives. And even though it wasn't a storage unit, a lot of the materials was scanned and put on Omeka. The problem is, even though we had all these images and all these other things, we had no information to it. So it just blank. So part of the oral history project is going out and kind of collecting information from the indirect conversations and placing it in there. Like, oh, that's, for example, a certain drag queen. We don't know the name of the person. We don't know who she is. But then talking about, the drag culture, they'll mention somebody like, oh, wait a second. And we'll demonstrate the picture and we kind of build off the information from there. So there has been an issue in terms of the archives and getting information to present it to the public. that's the part I wanted to mention.
Yeah, I guess I can go a little bit off of what Alexis was just saying, and then kind of what everybody has talked about. So I didn't really know that I was like getting into oral history preservation like when I started the podcast that I started. I'm a chemistry grad student, so I know very little about the entire like field of preservation. But one of the things that was the biggest challenge when I started was that there just like wasn't any ground to walk on in terms of like finding out any history of LGBTQ chemists, much less scientists. It's really hard to find any information. You see like maybe a few names here and there, like every Pride Month, some of the science magazines will like highlight a few like historical chemists, but there's like no information out there pretty much at all. And then especially once you start to narrow in on a specific field like chemistry. I forgot who said it, but about working with like living, like people who are still alive, like hearing their stories and collecting their stories, like those are the only stories that we have to go off of for the most part, because pretty much like before the 90s or so, in the chemistry field, it was really like a don't ask, don't tell culture when it came to like your identities. Science is like hailed as being like value free, and like no outside forces can ever affect like the just pure science that you do in a lab. And so for a long time, like that just kept people completely silent and completely like closeted. And so when I started graduate school, I couldn't even name like a single queer chemistry professor, like from the past, present, like anybody. So I've just learned a lot about how like these stories are some of the only like now records that we have of what it was like to even be a graduate student in the 90s, or, like becoming a tenured professor when you're the only queer woman professor in a department full of cis white men. Like a lot of the stories that we've heard, especially from like older professors, have been some of the only examples that me and at least like my community of scientists can point to and say like this is where we are coming from as like a field. So it's just like it was really hard. Like it still is really hard. There's like, yeah, there's just nothing to go off of as far as I'm concerned, at least.
I agree, and that actually really ties well to our next point, which is talking about access and power, and how queer preservation and queer history is limited in some cases the Ivory Tower. Who can afford to take time off to publish a book? Who can afford to buy those books if those books are $200? Or like as Marcus said, how do you if you can't access an archive, if nothing's digitized? What do you do? How do you teach this in schools? So I'd love for you folks to discuss that next.
I'll go ahead and jump in. I think that why do you have to ask the hardest question? But yeah, no, it's absolute that I think that particularly with, I mean, there are plenty of queer folks within the Ivory Tower. But I think the purpose of, particularly when we're talking about queering preservation, is this, I mean, I personally kind of adopt this kind of broader definition of queering that is kind of hearkening back to kind of, gay liberation, queer liberation days, where it's like, queer, is this term that used to mean odd and weird and non-normative, and let's, embrace that and tear the whole thing down. So of course we're talking about, I'm talking about it more broadly. How do we make this kind of information, which I personally believe can be very important to identity creation, more accessible to folks who, through the forces that are at play in history that are connected to power, do not have access to the spaces where these kinds of conversations can happen, or where, you know, this kind of information is put out, or how it's put out. I think that kind of also thinking about some of the points my fellow panelists have brought up, I think that there's, well, kind of starting within kind of historical research, to add complication to this issue. There are so many ways that within historical research, within institutions, within archives, that queerness can be taken and not used for forces of liberation, for in the service of liberation, in the service of truth telling. Earlier when Emma was mentioning, you know, the importance of personal objects connected to stories, connected to intimate histories and identity. If, for example, some of those objects, particularly if they're not from an LGBT activist whose identity is part of their political work more explicitly, it can be really easy for the objects and the memorabilia of someone who happens to be queer. And not saying that that needs to be centered in their life, if that wasn't centered for them. But especially in those cases, it's very easy to erase it. Oh, younger folks are constantly joking about this. Oh, they were just friends because they lived together. And because they didn't have, LGBT pride on a shirt that they donate to whatever collection. So there's, this queer erasure that is happening even in the collection of objects from queer folks. And this particularly comes up in, I believe this website is on the resource guide. In my work, I worked earlier this summer as a research assistant for the Invisible Histories Project, Georgia site, which is a project that started in Birmingham and has kind of spread out to a few different southern states, Mississippi and Georgia, and is working on collecting, documenting, and exhibiting the histories and the archives of Southern queers, particularly those based in rural areas. And so I think that that for me kind of brought up a lot of these issues of, well, if it's not someone, say, who, is a big name queer person who's kind of put themselves out there as that, what if it's just I'm thinking specifically of this lesbian couple that lives in North Georgia who owns a craft shop called the Gourd Place, and they make gourd crafts. But so without, but they're not out on the front lines, kind of thing, advertising, we're the queers you should look at. And so that's something I think important to think of. And I think particularly looking at those histories, it also makes me, adding more complication to this soup that we're making. Not all centering queerness should be, we have to think about doing that in a way that's not just voyeuristic. Like, we're going to focus on you because you're queer. But I think queer history allows us to be able to rethink why we're centering anybody, particularly in historical interpretation and in archives. Because if we can't center them for a person being queer, then why are we centering them? Why then are we centering people who are supposedly straight? And I think one of the reasons we're all talking about oral histories, though there's many aspects of the archive we could talk about, is that it's very difficult to, I don't think that's the word, but straight wash an object if you have very explicit stories from those people connected to those objects. And I think that oral histories, once again, folks telling their stories in their own words are very powerful. Because I was thinking of that as we're all kind of going into the oral history stuff. I think that's one of the reasons why we keep talking about it. So that's just a few thoughts of, things we need to keep in mind within these institutions. And I'll just make a quick note, maybe for someone else to jump on. In terms of connection with those not in these institutions, I think that is some of the really powerful and scary work of universities and even certain museums and other historical institutions really rethinking who are they actually serving and who is benefiting from this work that's being done. particularly if it's work done about and using the stories of marginalized people. So that's just, I'm going to say that quick note, and maybe someone else can kind of go with it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that you said, especially with problems and that like Marcus and Alexis had brought up earlier about kind of, as I've like delved more into my work, it's almost like there are ways that the archives can be seen or misinterpreted or misused as an extension of the Ivory Tower instead of as a public history field. Like there's this idea that the archive is inaccessible. It's like just for scholars and researchers and professors that already know what they're doing. When you know, a lot of my work is like, no, like the archive is for the people. It should be at least a community public space where you can mobilize and legitimize, you know, social justice movements. And a lot of the problems of the archive go back to a lack of funding, just like how a lot of historical institutions are. You know, we rely on donors. You know, the institution I work at is a nonprofit, so we literally just keep enough money to stay afloat. And, you know, a space on the archive shelf, interns that should always be paid, interns should always be paid, a space on the shelf, interns, digitization, those are all initiatives that are really expensive. And, you know, not many people are providing a lot of financial support to the archives and historical institutions in their area. And it all kind of trickles down into the donors have a specific agenda, have a specific, you know, collection that they want digitized and put online. And the donors obviously, you know, are very affluent, extremely wealthy. So that trickles into what collections get prioritized, and what collections, you know, are left out of the spotlight. And something that is really like important to me in that, you know, the place that I work at for Ohio Valley history, it doesn't really come off as like a place for queer history. It's a place where, you know, it's Ohio Valley history, it's Kentucky, you might not expect much, but, you know, I can't even tell you how many collections there are where I've looked into a specific figure and it turns out that they happen to be queer. And it's like, there are so many different people and collections that every other day it's like, oh, this person might have been gender nonconforming. This person might have had a relationship with someone of the same gender. And, you know, we as archivists need to ask ourselves, you know, what do we miss when we look at collections, you know, the first time? When we re-index, re-catalog, and re-evaluate our collections, we need to ask ourselves, you know, what perspective am I bringing that has blind spots for other collections? So have I cut off a little bit? I think I have.
So what Emma was just talking about, so basically you made me think of, so one of the, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is one of the problems that or one of the things that I had to work through it in my work was kind of wrestling with this idea that I have the power to name, right? So we do this oral history work, we do this archival work, and we use these documents, whether they're verbal or kind of like physical, but then we craft those narratives, right? So one of the things with my subject who I research is that of all of the documents that I have written by him, so documents where he's discussing his life, his work or whatnot, never once does he self-identify as gay. And of course, this was in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. So the language was different there, and the identification was different there. But at the same time, the writings about him always called him gay, right? They always said that Dill was this gay man and he did this, that, and the other. And something with that just kind of didn't sit right with me, right? Because part of the the issue that I found was with, and this maybe is jumping ahead a little bit of doing this work, it was deeply personal to me. And I think as Beck, as you were speaking, I was thinking of this kind of phrase that as I was discussing this work with a friend of mine, and they kind of, I don't know if they coined this term, but it was the first time I'd ever heard it, but they referred to as Dill as kind of within this lineage of my intellectual ancestry, right? So that him as a Black queer sociologist within this lineage of Black queer sociologists, there's this this intellectual ancestry. So there's this familiarity, and I felt the need to take care with how I tell the story. But then there's also like his actual ancestors, right? I have found. He didn't actually have any kids himself, but I have found living ancestors of his. So then this raises questions of me telling the story and how do I describe him and what he did, and the power in that, and the power that I have to tell the story that maybe other people don't want told, and to take care. And maybe things that he himself wouldn't have told, right? So just kind of going back to the naming. So I always say he was queer because by our contemporary understanding, he was a lifelong bachelor and he had sex with men. So I don't know if he was gay, but he was definitely queer according to our modern definitions of it, right? So yeah, so there, that personalization does also come up in there as well, which I know we'll talk about later. So I saw Alexis trying to jump.
Yes, so a point that Ty mentioned in the beginning was, Ty and Emma, was about the Ivory Tower. And one of the ways that I think our museum pretty much found a way to penetrate that Ivory Tower with the public is using social media platforms to demonstrate the archive. So every Tuesday and Fridays, we post on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, certain things from the archives, like a little thread from the archives, and even the images that we don't have any information from. We ask people, do you have any information about this? So there is this active participation with the community itself. So I think that's one way for us to at least get out of that power struggle, or that power hold over the archives and being part of that Ivory Tower. I think another issue in terms of power itself is the issue of observant and participant. Because as oral historians, we might be the interviewer, right? But having that connection with the interviewee also plays a part into that discourse. So then, like, how do we navigate that? And then how do we transform that into something that's productive for the community without putting your own bias into it? So, yeah.
Beck, do you have any thoughts on this?
Oh, no, Emma, please jump in. I don't want to stop any.
I think I've had like some connectivity issues, so I apologize for that. But one thing that I've, to respond to Alexis's like concern, which I definitely share, it's like the power of the finding aid. It's, making finding aids collaborative, accessible, and available for public comment is extremely important. There is an initiative that's in the resource document. It's from Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia. They came up with an amazing like anti-racist metadata resource, and I highly recommend it. And they talk about how finding aids becoming collaborative and having feedback from researchers or just from the public in general can be incredibly lucrative in trying to dismantle the power structures of the archive that kind of mimic the classroom at times. The archivist bestows the knowledge onto the, uneducated public, and, we are the like harbinger of all knowledge, that we hold everything. And, we limit what we can provide to you, when knowledge curation should be involving the public, because it's for the public, and we should be providing for the communities that we claim to serve. So making finding aids collaborative, accessible, and available is really important in securing or dismantling rather the, the power structures that we have in the Ivory Tower and institutions of public history adjacent to the Ivory Tower.
Thank you so much. And before we move on to the next topic, I just want to say that everyone, if you have questions, you can throw them in the Q&A box and we will see them and we will answer them after this last section. So our last section is something that Marcus alluded to earlier. It's about me search and self-care. As we were talking about at the very beginning, queer history work is very, very personal, and it can take a toll. So I know I'll share a little anecdote that I identify as non-binary. I identify in the trans community, and working in the lesbian community, which does not like non-binary and trans because I think you're stealing from the butches or whatever, or this finding space, becoming non-binary is finding, like, trying to carve out space is very hard. And so I've gotten a lot of pushback and a lot of blowback, and it's been really hard. And it's one of the things that has made me sort of step back and be like, why am I doing this work? Should I still do this work? Because it's greatly impacting my mental health. And I still haven't come to a good conclusion on it. I'm still wrestling with it. So I'd love to hear what the panelists have to say.
Yeah, so I can start. So I think, like, doing, like, the work that I do in terms of just, like, collecting the stories of, like, LGBTQ scientists, like, a lot of it I think is still even trying to, like, convince the scientific community that, like, queer and trans people are, like, here and have been here, and that, like, we will still be here, and that, like, the scientific community, like, actually has to move with society, because for so long it hasn't, because it has, like, put itself in, like, a different corner where, like, they don't have to deal with any of those things. And so I think, like, that's particularly hard because it's not just about, like, having people who have never told their stories tell their stories and, like, make that a part of, like, scientific discourse, like, in this specific, like, community, but it's also about, like, trying to convince people that, like, trans people exist and that, like, we're allowed to exist in, like, spaces that have never acknowledged us and don't really want to acknowledge us now. And so I think, like, that's been really difficult, and just trying to convince like, the scientific community that, like, these people exist and that, like, we are carving spaces out for ourselves even in, like, a field that doesn't really, like, want us. And so I don't know, that's been, like, really hard for me. I think, like, the only way that I have, like, continued being able to, like, do this work and, like, the advocacy work that I do, like, within the STEM field in general, is just, like, having other, like, queer and trans scientists who are, like, doing their own, like, advocacy work, maybe not in, like, directly in, like, the telling of stories and, like, preservation, but in just, like, all sorts of, like, different avenues. I think, like, that has made me feel, like, less alone in some of the work that I do. But yeah, it is really hard, like, when I'm balancing, like, telling these stories that have never been told, as well as, like, being one of, like, 3 trans people in, like, the space that I, like, exist in every day. So it's a weird thing to balance.
Thank you both so much for being honest and vulnerable, kind of about the experiences. I think that's really the only way we deal with these issues, is to speak them. Just a real quick, Beck, I'll give you a quick book recommendation for any of the naysayers who say that queerness and science have nothing to do with each other. Jennifer Terry's An American Obsession, Science, Medicine, and Homosexuality in Modern Society. It's a good one. I'll post that in the chat after as well. Oh my gosh, yeah. I think that this work gets so personal so fast. I came out because I was doing queer history work. I thought I was just a really good ally. Turns out I'm too good of an ally. So, but yeah. So it's been, of course, I can't overstate how personally important this history work has been for me. But, at the same time, I do Southern history. And so queer Southern spaces are some of the most magical spaces ever. But there's definitely a lot of kind of traditionalist mindsets in these institutions that I would want to work in, whether that's universities, or I worked in museums and historical sites for a couple of years in between undergrad and grad school. And I think that I think one of the reasons I really attach to empathy building as one of the strengths of good history making is that that's a really great way to go about kind of talking about some of these difficult histories. And this has happened in my experience, not only for issues of sexuality and gender, but also issues of race. Working on that kind of empathy building tool that we have in our tool chest is a really transformative way to kind of tell really honest and powerful and challenging stories. But I think that I think something also to take into account as we are talking about taking care of ourselves and still doing this work is this HR kind of topic of, if there's homophobia, strong homophobia in a workplace culture, that's a pretty much a full stop to LGBT history and heritage work in any kind of meaningful way. Especially because of the, thank you very much. Especially because it is not uncommon for queer folks to do this queer history work. You know, for a lot of the reasons I talked about earlier and kind of perhaps have come up through all of us talking. And I think, therefore, I think this is why institutions and administrations in universities, in museums, at historical sites, in historical societies, in kind of government historical resources preservation departments have to get on board. And I think one of the ways that we can do that is this kind of work benefits everyone. Being able to be more comfortable talking about one's identity and experiences at work benefits everyone, regardless of if you are LGBTQ+. And I think, I think that American culture has a lot of shame kind of embedded into it when it comes to sex and gender. So I'm not going to say I know how to get in the middle of that and fix it, but I think it is important to bring up the issue of workplace culture, particularly if you're working within these more traditional public history or historical or even non-historical institutions. These conversations can't happen if, and I say that not only to kind of call out and to make accountable real homophobia that is within, you know, these institutions, but I think also I bring this up to make the point that until very recently, people were not given these tools to have these conversations. And so I think everyone taking a breath and remembering that might be a good step moving forward, because, you know, on one hand, queer folks doing this work sometimes have to face these insurmountable challenges of people who just don't know what any of this stuff is about, or don't understand, or have been discouraged from looking within themselves to kind of dig out some of these isms that they might have that may or may not be related to personal issues. But I bring all that up to kind of say, creating less homophobic workplaces is a really great place to start in doing meaningful history work beyond the really awesome ideas we've already talked about. So I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts about that, but that's my 2 cents.
So as you're speaking, I'm thinking of, and I'm kind of seeing this question in the chat. So I don't necessarily have a direct answer to that, but so I'm thinking of tangentially related, but still related, of this discourse surrounding Lil Nas X and the video he just released. And I'm seeing a lot of this kind of homophobic backlash, and part of it is like heavily racialized. And one of the questions that I saw kind of going around on social media, there's this discussion of like, what have gay people, specifically gay Black men, done for society or for Black people or for the culture besides like bring AIDS and all this stuff, right? So so Sarah, as you were thinking, I was kind of just thinking about the way that I've think about Deal and the reason why I find it so important to write him into the histories of, and even related to Beck's work of writing him into these histories and where that queerness intersects with that. And kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, is just like, it's that his queerness isn't necessarily the reason why I think he should be remembered. It's just that he is queer, but also did all this other work. And it's that blackness and that queerness that I personally find that personal attachment to, that I feel that it's important, because as a kind of in relation to Beck, I mean, in sociology, it's definitely more of it. There's more queer people in sociology today, but if we go back through our classical and even a lot of our contemporary theorizing and the people that we consider like the four founders of the discipline, we just aren't there. And it's only within the past 20 or so years that we've started kind of writing back in women and Black men into our histories. You know, some people call it kind of these affirmative action additions. But a big part of that is not just this kind of like this representational politics of, oh, now we have these textbooks that have these, look at all these different faces and people from these diverse backgrounds. Aren't we great? We can feel good about ourselves that we are showcasing diversity. But for me at least, and kind of the way I conceptualize his work, and again, putting back to the histories on what we can learn from putting all these other people back into the histories and recognizing their work, is reconsidering what we know about our disciplines and our fields. And again, for me specifically sociology, and what can we relearn, going back to the idea of memory, about the history of our fields, the assumptions that we have about the work that we do, when we reconsider, oh, so these people who have been left out or have been forgotten or ignored, we're doing this disciplinary work. And this whole century of work that has been done since then, that we now are the benefactors are does not include that work as the basic foundation, right? So what are we missing out when that foundational work has been left out, right? So part of my work then is writing that back in, and then kind of theorizing and thinking about, okay, so what then do we gain by writing this person back into these disciplines, right? And then even just on a personal level, again, I don't know that I ever had a queer instructor in undergrad or even grad school, but I know they weren't in the textbooks. So I think just personally, I'm just putting myself back into the position of, a freshman or sophomore in undergrad. How great would it have been for me to see this person in these textbooks and saying, hey, it's not just that we're doing this work today and Black queer people are represented today, but they were here 100 years ago at the very foundations of the discipline, and the sense of belonging. How does that situate a sense of belonging to people who are coming into the field, especially as like young people or people new to the discipline?
So I guess I'll touch on 2 points. Excuse me. About the self-care and research. So actually, I am a medievalist. I'm a medievalist and both a queer historian. It's kind of weird. And I've been lately, for the past couple months, torn apart by these two because of the different methodologies that they use. And one of the things that I've been struggling with my research for my thesis has been examining the issues or the idea of queerness within medieval works, so like homoerotic poetry. And there's this constant debate since the 80s and 90s where, what we may deem as queer or homoerotic, for some may say, oh, that's just ambiguous terms. Those are just open to be interpreted. They're not representing men, but rather masculine women and this and that. And it is a problem because you have these two opposing, I guess, methodologies, and you're trying to at least combine it within your research. And that has been very difficult for me. Taking a step back and realizing that there's only so much I can do. and there's only so much I can argue, can be, has at least helped me in that sense. I forgot what I was gonna say. I guess that's one thing I had to say.
Does anyone else have anything to add before we move into questions? Audience questions? No? All right. So folks, if you haven't put your questions in the comment box, do so now, because we're going to answer them. And we do have one. So this is from Sarah, who asks a bit of a callback, but it was mentioned that queerness is about sex. Where does that leave asexual people in the preserving of that history? Any recommendations or suggestions for remembering those who do not identify with invisible orientation? Disclaimer, not to say that as people don't have sex, but generally the form of attraction is experienced differently across the spectrum. So yeah. Does anyone want to tackle that?
I will say that is a very much under, at least in my experience, a very much under focused on kind of aspect of queer history broadly defined. What I will say about that is that I find that I mentioned something along these lines earlier, but I think one of the really, when I said earlier, you know, how can we center queer people while not being voyeuristic, and also the active verb queering something, kind of combining some of those ideas. Some of the best research that I've seen done that is queer history or trans history uses queer and trans, etc., as lenses to look at history. And I think one of the most powerful things that we can gain from doing that work, as opposed to just looking for queer, trans, asexual, etc., people in history, which Marcus, you kind of talked about the pitfalls of trying to do that, is I think one of the powerful things that this kind of work can do is help us make visible these assumptions that I know I have taken in from the world and the society and the country I grew up in. This means assumptions and definitions based on right and wrong sex, right and wrong gender, right and wrong ways of gender expression. I think that by making those more visible and these kind of assumptions and less normalized and less naturalized through queer history, through trans history, through taking lenses, an asexual lens on history, we can completely rethink the definitions that we have that sometimes sneak their way back into queer history itself. And so I think that being able to question sexual definitions and assumptions and norms, gender definitions, assumptions and norms, that I also think is one of the really transformative works of history, that how it can impact the world we live in today. And, you know, as a kind of case study example, not necessarily for asexual history, but kind of queer history, is another book recommendation, Jonathan Ned Katz's The Invention of Heterosexuality, which in itself is, I think, a very funny name, but it kind of defines the point. Yeah, that's my 2 cents on that.
Does anyone else have anything to add? All right, we do have another question, and it's for me, so I feel kind of awkward answering this because I haven't really talked about this. I haven't really talked on this panel. But the question is you touched on some pushback you were getting from the lesbian community. Can you expand on what issues are coming up and where you think they're coming from? The TLDR is transphobia. And the long answer is also transphobia. But basically, there's been this push for so long, especially with lesbians, for women's only spaces, that they tend to forget that not all people stay women forever, and not all people are assigned women at birth, or a lot of the other various pitfalls we have when we assign two genders when when gender is a spectrum, or we think and we look at gender as a certain way. So that's part of the problem. And some of the other problems I've been facing is that, so like what happens when, so I've been very explicit in some of the work that I've done about telling the stories of trans men who were basically excommunicated from like the lesbian community as soon as they transitioned. They were like, no, you don't belong here anymore. You can't come inside. Or like people would be aggressive. They would shove them. And I mean, the same things happen to trans women. And it's awful, and it's not a good feeling. Having experienced it, it is not a good feeling to have. And so it's just that's basically some of it. And lesbians really want a lot of the problems with queer history is we have so little history. Lots of folks want to look on it with rose-colored glasses, but the problem is you can't. There's tons of racism. There's tons of ableism. There's tons of sexism. There's like every ism you can imagine, like fat phobia, like disabled issues, like it's all in queer history, and you can't just tell it through rose-colored glasses. You have to tell it all because that's how it exists. And if you want to reckon with, and you have to reckon with that, we have to reckon with that as historians. It doesn't do the community justice just to tell the pretty, beautiful stories and the feel-good things. It just doesn't do it. From YouTube, we have a couple of questions. Let's talk about a little bit about a question about recognizing sites beyond bars. And we did talk about this in our pre-meeting. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about meeting. So let's talk about some of that work and what you see. And Marcus, I really love in the paper that you sent me talking about the print shop, like things like that. I love that kind of stuff. So yeah, please talk about it, please.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, no, I think this is just generally an important question because I think that's one of the things that, especially now as kind of we see this kind of idea of this kind of decline of like the gay bar, whatnot, and where do queer people go for spaces? It's even an interesting contemporary conversation, but just in the case of Augustus Granville Dill, so much of his as I mentioned earlier, his training in this kind of like subfield of Black sociology very much centered his scholarship and his public activism on the advancement and the uplift of Black people. And so he kind of did that where he was physically located, where he was positioned in the community that he was in. And one of the ways that he did that was, and this was after he left working for the Crisis magazine, the NAACP magazine, and he was fired. And he kind of, the kind of history of his life kind of goes, there's like fits and stops. There's like a period where there's a lot of information, then he goes dark for a little bit. But starting in around 1927, 1928, he kind of starts showing back up in these newspaper archives. So this was another thing I guess I just wanted to touch on as well, is like the patchwork of work that I had to do of going to the physical archives, the Du Bois archives, and just even using like newspaper.com archives and kind of pulling all these disparate pieces and then constructing this life history of him. But yeah, so he opens Harlem's personal service shop, which whenever I give like independent talk, I like to pull up the Google Maps. It's 236 West 135th Street, and you can see the shop is still there. Last I looked, it was a barber shop, and it's in Harlem, so it's still there. So there's something I feel really attached to that I appreciate. But he used that service shop though as kind of a base for community building with the people in Harlem. So part of it was this kind of just utilitarian practice of having a phone that he let people use, or he let people in the neighborhood use his address, right? Because there was a lot of people who didn't have permanent addresses or who had personal home phones. So by giving them access to those things, he kind of gave them this access to civic life, right? To be able to send and receive mail. But beyond that, a big part of his kind of activism, and again, coming from his own personal background as a pianist and someone who sang and was heavily involved in theater and art preservation himself, is that he used that shop as a platform for other people, right? So There's some figures that I've come across like Ruby Elsie and Annie Wiggins who went on to perform on Broadway, Black performers, and they did some of their first shows at his service shop. He also, just on the topic of platforming, him and Du Bois produced a magazine called The Brownies Book from 1920 to 1921, which was a magazine, the first ever magazine directed or targeted for Black children. And it was also the first place where Langston Hughes was published. And Dill kind of mentored Langston Hughes, and he lived with him for a while, and he introduced him to the Harlem social life. So one of the things kind of more generally outside of the Ivory Tower and outside of sociology that I highlight with Dill was the work that he had in kind of producing culture, and these figures like Langston Hughes, like that many of us know about today, and that he had instrumental roles in introducing them into the kind of like public discourse and connecting them with people. So that's part of that history that I wanted to bring up. It also ties in with our understanding of what we know about Black political action through art and through material, giving material benefits. So basically paying people for their art, for their time, for their labor. That is oftentimes when we think of kind of activism or work like that, we think of kind of like straight on political, marching the streets, organizing, things like that. But he was doing his own form of activism in that way, by especially at his time and through the Brownies Book, and through, he had a library and he had artifacts in his store, basically kind of countering these narratives again at the time. So again, when I give this talk, I do this juxtaposition of these kind of really racialized depictions of Black children at the time. And you can imagine what they look like, and is doing this juxtaposition between these depictions of Black children that were prominent at his time with pictures that he had published in the Brownies Book, and of just Black children having fun and living their lives, and the importance of showing those representations, not just for other Black people, but also if we think about who was reading these documents in Harlem, a big part of who was reading Harlem writers were white people, right? So these are representations then that kind of normalize or show a different view of Black people for white people at the time. So he just did a lot of different cultural work, again, that I'll root back to being influenced by his training in Black sociology at Latin University.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, there are, because you talked about like queer history being told through art, and these spaces, being explored, and queer identities being explored through art. And I found that as a similar case through queer journalism and gay press. My senior honors thesis was on Kentucky gay press and the women in print movement that was extremely influential in the South. A book that I would recommend is The Lesbian South, Women, I have it on my shelf, but it's The Women in Print Movement by, I forget who it was, but they're like my icon. I don't know why I can't remember their name, but yeah, it's like, outside of bars, writing and poetry and journalism were the ways in which the lines between Birmingham and Louisville and Nashville and Orlando were drawn. And, that is how, yes, thank you, Ty, for that. Yeah, it's The Lesbian South. It's a really great book. If I did not have that book, my senior honors thesis would not. I wouldn't have had anything to go off of. Yeah, Southern feminist women in queer. Yeah, Harker. There we go. But it's through newsletters, through exchanging books, through feminist bookstores, a distinctly Southern queer identity was established and also shared amongst people in the Midwest, in the West, in the North. And so, it's art, journalism, print, personal shops. There's a lot of queer history and queer sites specifically to be found outside of bars. Half of the Kentucky queer history map, we have over like 300 sites that we've mapped through ArcGIS. And I would say many of them are bars, but as many bars there's even more churches. And in smaller Kentucky towns, they might not have a bar, but they do have a church where a lot of organizations would meet. And I'm proud to say that Vico, Kentucky is still the smallest town to have a fairness ordinance in place to protect discrimination against outlaw discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, which is an accomplishment not many national organizations can say. And so, yeah, it's like in these rural areas, even if they don't have a bar, there's a church, there's a bookstore, there are other places where queer people can find out about their identities and, you know, explore their identities with other queer people. And that's extremely important to preserve.
Real quick, I'm sorry, Ty.
We are at time.
I know. Okay. I'm gonna put it in
real
the chat.
Quick,
so I'm not
real
gonna,
quick.
I know. I'm not going to talk about. I'm just going to put it in the chat. There's some really great research out there about Black queer folks and using the church and faith as kind of sites of queer community making. So I'm going to put those in the chat so that Ty can wrap up.
Put them in the resource guide too.
Oh yes, I'll do that too.
So thank you everyone for attending. Unfortunately, we're at time, so we can't answer any more questions. But if you go to the resource guide, you can, which I'm going to share one last time, you can find all of the ways to find us on social media and LinkedIn and professional and all of that. One last time. And yes, so thank you all so much for joining us. This has been amazing. Thank you, Sarah, for giving us the platform to have this conversation. And thank you to the sponsors of Dismantle Preservation for sponsoring this and making this a free event. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a great rest of your night. Sarah, do you have anything to say before?
You can't run away yet. No, thank you everyone so much for being here. I really appreciate it. If you would like to continue the conversation with us, don't forget tomorrow there's a full lineup of conversations, including a lightning talk titled "To Carve Out Space Toward Transgender Inclusion in Museums." And you should also check out the recordings. Yesterday or Tuesday, there were 2 really great talks on LGBTQ preservation efforts in the UK. So making sure we are getting some international perspectives in there as well. But thank you so much, everyone. You know, the panelists, wonderful expertise. I just want to give a tiny sliver of background. Ty and I wanted to do this panel because I was just so sick of only hearing about rainbow heritage efforts in New York City and San Francisco. And you all gave a wonderful discourse on why we need to look outside the coast and how we can find and see full lives being lived across the country. So I really appreciate everything that you did and for sharing all these resources. We have a ton of homework to do now, but I really hope everybody will come back tomorrow for the transgender inclusion in museums conversation, because what's been reinforced in this conversation again and again is we need to help make sure people feel welcome and like they can be a part of the preservation movement, because it sucks to hear some people on this panel feel like they don't feel included, and that's not what we want to hear. So thank you for being here and for sharing this space.
Thank you so much for having us, Sarah.
Thank you, Ty, for putting this together.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thanks
for having us.
for everything.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Have
having
a great
us.
rest of your night, everybody. Please catch us somewhere on the internet. And if you like what people have to say, please hire them after they get out of grad school.